Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Please take a moment to click the like button, to subscribe to our channel, and to click the bell icon if you'd like to get reminders when a new episode drops.
So, if this is your first time watching this channel, what this is each week, Todd and I take a moment to discuss the gospel lectionary reading for the upcoming weekend. And our goal is to talk about that passage in the context of love and inclusion and societal justice. We want our conversation, our talking to be just talking, as in justice. But we also hope that something might be said in our conversation that might inspire you alongside with us to do more than just talking. So, Todd, what passage are we looking at this week?
We are in Matthew 22, continue to be in Matthew 22, this time with verses 34 through 46, and looking at a question posed to Jesus about the greatest commandment.
Yeah, so he just silences the Sadducees, which were those that had the next to highest political control in his day. And so then we see the Pharisees come in with their questions. And to understand, you had the high priestly class, you had the Sadducees, then you had the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are always competing with the Sadducees to gain more power. But one of the Pharisees comes in and says, "Which is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus answers, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind." And then the second one, love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and prophets hang on these two commandments. And then he gets into like some, son of David, Messiah type stuff. But we'll talk about that at the very end. You got any thoughts on this week, Todd?
Well, I think this is obviously um, really one of the core teachings of Jesus, because you really get to the heart of what really, again, I mean, he says everything hangs on those two laws, and there is this clearly, pulls pulls his uh, pulls his message to the heart. But I know you have some broader context and historical context that you can bring to this, and
Yeah.
I know
So
that'll
this
help.
this summing up the law through love, as in love to God or love to neighbor, is does it's not unique to Jesus, nor does it originate with Jesus. Jesus here is affirming this way of interpreting the law. There were multiple competing interpretations of what fidelity to Torah looked like in Jesus' society. And the more compassionate way of interpreting Torah through the lens of loving God and loving your neighbor actually is attributed to a contemporary, but a little before Jesus, a Pharisee by the name of Hillel. This is old hat to some of our listeners. To some of you, this may be new, but the question was asked to Hillel one day by a proselyte if he could explain the whole law while standing on one foot, and Hillel says, "What you find hateful yourself, don't do to someone else. The rest of the law is just commentary. Go learn that." And so it was the golden rule in essence. And this
Mm-hmm.
was pre-existing to Jesus. It was already in motion around the time of Jesus. What the Jesus community is doing is announcing that they side with that way of interpreting Torah, that Jesus sided that way with interpreting Torah. One of the other competing voices was the Pharisaical school of Shammai, and the Shammai Pharisees they They were more concerned with preserving Jewish identity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But preserving Jewish identity in a time where you had Hellenism encroaching and you had Roman culture and the Roman Empire and all of that influence, trying to keep the Jewishness of Jewish culture and kind of some pretty strict lines of demarcation between what was Jewish and what wasn't. And so they tended to be more conservative in their interpretations of the Torah, where the Pharisees were, they were all about love, and the Hillelians were more about love and loving your neighbor and a more compassionate way of interpreting Torah. The Shammai Pharisees were much more focused on, preserving Jewish identity, making a strict
Mm-hmm.
demarcation between Jew and Gentile, and those types of differences, and clean and unclean, all of that stuff. So usually when this is not always, but usually whenever we see Jesus coming in conflict with the Pharisees in the Jesus story, it's helpful for us to remember that this would have been the school of Shammai. Um, that the issues that Jesus had with the school of Shammai in the Gospels is the same issue. They're the same issues that the Hillelian Pharisees would have had with the Shammai Pharisees. So again, these are all discussions happening within Judaism between different Jewish voices that are in conversation and debate with one another. It is a sad, sad thing that being so far removed from that culture, Christians read the story today and they see Jesus opposed to Judaism or Christianity opposed to Judaism, rather than
Mm-hmm.
this rich conversation happening within Judaism between this sect of Jews who said, you can interpret the Torah through love. And another said, there's more to it than just that. But
Mm-hmm.
but that that lens of love as the way to interpret what fidelity to the God of the Torah looked like. That's really what
Mm-hmm.
this week the first part of this week's reading is about. Is Jesus and the Jesus community of Matthew that are following him are casting their lot on the side of
Mm-hmm.
Hillel. And it's interesting that the school of Shammai were the Pharisees that were mostly in power among the Pharisees in the Jesus story. But by the time you get to the Gospel of Matthew being written down, AD 70 or sorry 70 CE had taken place, and along with the destruction of Jerusalem, and we know that out of these competing interests among the Pharisees, what won out among the Pharisees was not the more conservative fundamentalist Pharisees, but the more progressive liberal Pharisees, and that evolved into rabbinic Judaism. And there's a lot of good stuff in it. I mean, when people kind of
Mm-hmm.
use the term Pharisee as a derogatory term, which sometimes happens, well, often happens in Christianity, the
Mm-hmm.
Pharisees ended up teaching more alongside what Jesus did than we give them credit for. I mean, Gamaliel, I think, was a Pharisee of the school of Hillel. And the reason I think that is because later in the in the book of Acts, Paul claims to have been a student of Gamaliel. And Paul's famous way of defining fidelity to the Torah in Galatians is
Mm-hmm.
love your neighbor as yourself, for in this all of the law is fulfilled.
Yep.
That's not Jesus, that's Hillel. Now Jesus agreed
Mm-hmm.
with him and put his stamp on that and saying,
Mm-hmm.
yep, that's the right track. But that's Hillelian Phariseeism right there,
Yeah. And I think
defining
this is just
righteousness
such
as love.
such an important lesson besides the message of the greatest two commandments, but just the fact of how understanding this history can really show that you can arrive at a message very similar to Jesus without Jesus.
Yeah.
And when you look at a number of progressive branches of Judaism today, you are seeing religions that seem to be very close to a Hillelian mode of living in the world, loving in the world, um, and you're you are seeing, you can see many people of faith, which then again, of course, then teaches us also we need to watch. Can you arrive at these principles without scripture? Can you arrive at these principles in other ways, as our atheist friends do or agnostic friends do? And the answer is yes. That the same mode of love for your fellow man, for your fellow human being, is the same, is a universal message that has been continually being brought up by religious and a-religious people over time. It we keep coming back to this, and
It has to be that way, Todd. Otherwise, as zealous as some of our fellow Christians may be, what you end up doing is backing yourself into a corner, because the majority of the human race has never even heard about Jesus. They lived before Jesus. The majority of the human race also has lived outside of any cognitive knowledge of the scriptures or the Bible. So it has to be that people can arrive at these universal truths, and have arrived at these universal truths. I mean, it's a historical fact. They have arrived at these universal truths through other ways, other means, other wisdom.
That's right.
It's a lot bigger.
It's just and it should humble us in talking about Jesus, and allow us to recognize that Jesus himself was a learner of others over time, and he learned, and that doesn't reduce Jesus, because any great mystic, any great religious leader in history had to learn from somebody. And Jesus learned as well.
And Mary and Joseph would have raised Jesus. What it looks like is they raised Jesus on the teachings of Hillel.
Right.
And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. It says something about them.
Yeah, it does. So for those of you who teach from this passage, or you're just looking for more nuts and bolts, this week's reading is found in each one of the synoptics. It's in Mark 12, it's in Luke 10, and the passages from the Torah that are being quoted are Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5, and Leviticus 19, 18. They're separated, kind of cherry picked, taken out of context by Jesus here, but Hillel did it too. And I want to encourage everybody to go back and actually read Leviticus 19:18, because it's more than just loving your neighbor as yourself. It's a little broader than that. Even with all that stuff about Hillel and Shammai, there are two times that I want to draw attention to, because I think it makes a strong case for the flavor of Christianity we should be leaning into today as Jesus followers. There are two times where Jesus actually rejected Hillelian Phariseeism and sided with the Shammai Pharisees. The first one was over divorce. Hillel taught that you could divorce a woman in the patriarchal society for any reason whatsoever. If she burned your toast, you could divorce her, right? And Shammai came in and said, no, there is no divorce. Divorce is not allowed. And Jesus in the gospel sides with Shammai. In one gospel, he says divorce isn't allowed. In another gospel, he says it's only allowed if there's infidelity. And the reason I believe that he sides there is not because of some high ideal he has for an institution of marriage as we define it today. And I mean, as fundamentalist Christians define it today. I know marriage can be defined in multiple ways in our culture today, and it has been defined multiple ways in the scriptures. But the nuclear family, that way of define, Jesus isn't concerned with the sanctity of marriage here. He's concerned with the economic state that women were being left in when they were being sent away willy-nilly within a patriarchal culture, where their economic survival was dependent upon them being attached to a man. Jesus says it's not right for a woman for you to be able to send her away for any reason whatsoever, that it's not economically just to do that. So his concern was for economic justice, not preserving marriage.
Right. Yeah,
And
that's
and
that's crucial
and,
because
and the
that
other
because it's been otherwise it would make Jesus, if it's not about women's justice and women's protection, then it does turn into this misunderstanding about being used for the nuclear 20th 21st century family, which is uh, not what his concern is at all. There's there are plenty of in the way marriage is structured today, there are a number of reasons why divorce may be the right thing,
That's
and
right.
and so
It doesn't
that
have the
needs to
same
be.
economic implications today as it did back then for women.
It doesn't not
And in a
there's
lot of those
still.
cultures, only men could divorce. It wasn't true in all Roman cultures, but in some of the communities, it was that women couldn't divorce their husbands. Only men could divorce women.
Right,
So
right.
it's completely lopsided. And that's why Jesus is saying there's an
Yeah,
economic justice principle here.
you created a new word. I think there's
Economic.
economic justice.
Economic
That's
justice.
just
So the other time that Jesus sided with Shammai was over the proselyte. And I don't know that he sided with Shammai as much as he just disagreed with Hillel. Hillel had created the proselyte, and to define that, to help people understand, for those who aren't familiar with what that is, um, remember in Jesus' society, there were only haves and have nots. There was no middle class. There was the wealthy and the poor. That's all there was, the working class and the wealthy. And a lot of that working class was dependent upon loans from the wealthy to survive each year that they would borrow from and then pay back, borrow from and then pay back. And when years of debt cancellation, one of the objections to having a year of jubilee or debt cancellation was that as that year got closer, people would stop making loans because they knew those loans were going to be canceled and they would miss out on the investment. And so Hillel's solution was that as we got closer, if a creditor was really worried about it, he could declare a loan proselyte, and that would therefore that loan would be immune to being forgiven or canceled in the year of which all debts were canceled and slaves were set free. And Jesus rejects proselyte in the Gospels and says, nope, uh, there should be a year of jubilee where all debts are canceled and
right,
all slaves are set free. There's no exemption. That's not. There's no loophole for the wealthy.
right.
Um. So hold on a second. I just saw that my internet connection is unstable. So I'm going to skip my wireless and see if it has a problem here.
Hmm.
All right. But so there's two, and again, this was a concern for economic justice as well. So in both cases where economic justice was on the line, then
Mhm.
Jesus rejected the Hillelian school and sided with an economic justice. In most other cases where it was about loving your neighbor and loving God and which is, loving your neighbor includes economic justice, but where
Right.
it was defined as love, he was completely in lockstep harmony, taught very much many of the same things that Hillelian Pharisees would have been teaching during his time, which says to me, and this is my whole point in saying this, that what it says to me is it makes a strong case that today Jesus followers and following this Jesus in the story should have an interpretive lens towards the scripture that places love first, that prioritizes love first, that values love above all else, and that it is also deeply concerned about economic and societal justice, where we care about the poor. And so what it makes a case for me today for progressive forms of Christianity that are love based, um, that create more loving followers, better humans, more compassionate humans, but that are first and foremost also very much concerned with economic justice on the level where if they were in someone else's position, that loving your neighbor is first and foremost. What is the justice you would want done for you if you were in their situation? So it's a case, I think, for a love-based progressive Christianity that is very much distributively just or distributive justice minded.
Hmm. Because, and along with that, it's important to honor Jesus for not being beholden to one party or the other. That he was willing to operate independently and and bring a consistency in his teaching that was lacking in those two schools of Pharisaical thought, and he raises the bar in aligning aligning across the board things that are just for all people,
Mhm.
and I think that bears so much, uh, or brings so much to bear on how we engage with our religions, with our religious traditions, how loyal we are to our religious traditions, and how they, and whether they align or don't align with the justice teachings of Jesus, or I mean the universal justice principles that we referenced earlier, um, and politically, that we stay true to what Jesus is calling to, and what what the justice principles are, and don't defend the party that we typically vote for when they stray from that, and they do stray from it.
Mhm.
I would argue that the our foreign policy is very much a we're much too unjust in our foreign policy in many ways, even though we are charitable in a number of ways. We ultimately are very self-interested at our country dominating, and that abuses and exploits people in other parts of the world. And I think that that has to be recognized, and it's true regardless of political party. It's a problem that both parties um, buy into way too much.
Yeah,
And
when
I
we
think
talk about
and
Sadducees,
that's what. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say when we talk about Sadducees versus Pharisees in the Jesus story and the high priestly class, most of whom were Sadducees, that's the party they belonged to. We have to remember that these were not religious organizations. These were what we would call today, and it's a little anachronistic, but it's what we would call today political parties. It was the temple state.
Mm-hmm.
And they were vying. There was no separation of church and state. They were all vying for political power. Today, we don't have Sadducees, we don't have Pharisees, we don't have Hillel and Shammai and all that stuff, but we
Mm-hmm.
do have a two-party system here,
Mm-hmm.
and we could argue over whether or not one party is most often more concerned with social justice than the
Mm-hmm.
other one. But even the one that's more socially justice minded at times still gets it wrong sometimes. As you're
Yeah.
pointing out, foreign policy
Yeah.
still gets it wrong, doesn't always side with justice. So, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge when we get it right, the areas that we are pushing for a
Mm-hmm.
more just society, but still also hold those parties and politicians and religious institutions and all of that, still hold them to account when they are where they may be getting it right in one area, but they're still violating the principles of justice in another area.
Mm-hmm. The One of the challenges that I had faced as a pastor in a denomination prior to my becoming a chaplain now is my denomination, uh, at the global level, had a low view of justice as being central to the heart of who Jesus was and what he taught. And so they were much more concerned about at focusing on an eschatology and focusing on personal piety, they're frankly, they're more of the Shammai party in a lot of ways, in the way that they focused on personal identity and cultural identity within the denomination, and that's where those of us within the denomination had a responsibility to push back and to say this is not the way that the global level is going is not what is not at the heart of the gospel, and that's the responsibility that we have within whatever organization we have is to be willing to be honest and willing to be courageous enough to hold up areas where there is not leaning into justice.
Yeah, and these debates, these wrestlings, this tension, I think it exists in most communities. I mean, we're talking about religious communities here too, but I think of the debates between feminism and womanism, where feminism wants um, justice for women versus men, but womanism comes in and says, yeah, but not all women's experience is the same as white women's experience. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Mm-hmm.
I have friends who are just wealthy members of the LGBTQ community and are spot on when it comes to justice for LGBT folks of a certain class, but they still subscribe to and support some economic policies that are
Mm-hmm.
systemically harmful to poor people, including poor
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ people. So, really, what
Yep.
we're talking about here is intersectionality. I know Christians who are very much concerned about the poor, but are still deeply patriarchal when it comes to women, or
Mm-hmm.
homophobic, biphobic, or
Mm-hmm.
transphobic. And I know movements for economic justice, even among white Christians, that although they want economic justice, they only want it for certain, but they're still deeply racist in who
Mm-hmm.
they apply that economic justice
Mm-hmm.
for. And so, yeah, it's what we're talking about is a consistency of justice, even within justice work.
Right. Yep. And I think you could, man, we can keep going and going with examples. So I don't want to wear people out with more examples, but this is the ability for us who care, at least at least say we care about justice issues, the ability for us to deceive ourselves into having loopholes, into having or to denying certain people from the
Mm-hmm.
rights to justice is a real issue for all of us. It really is an issue for all of us that we all have to be very cognizant to, um, that we pay attention to the consistency across the board and aren't afraid to speak up about it. Um, it has to be it, we have to be vigilant to our own selves on this and to
Yeah,
our own organizations. We have to be vigilant.
and I see this, affirming that this week. Jesus was, when Hillel got it right, he's like, yeah, that's what I want to
Yep.
support. That's it. That's what, it's about love. But then when Hillel failed to be as consistent in the application of that for women, maybe under divorce, or the poor with the prosperous, Jesus said, we could be a little bit more consistent in how we apply this love of neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I know there's some people out
So what
there
else do you
who,
got for us?
yeah, there are some people out there that are looking at the entire passage and they're like, you guys just chose to talk about the easy part of this passage. What about that last part of the passage? And I do want to say something just briefly in it. There were most scholars today agree that when in the Jesus story, there are two competing narratives for this idea of a liberator for Israel, um, who later came to be called the Messiah in later iterations. But there were two ways of looking at this liberating figure. One was that he would be a son of David, and that he would restore Israel politically and liberate Israel from Roman occupation. And that's the son of David branch. But the other one is more rooted in Daniel 7 type imagery, where he's the son of man or the son of Adam. And and that liberation, he'd still come as a liberator, but that liberation would include Israel, but it would spill over and be for the entire world. It would be for all humanity. It would be a liberator of the world. And you see this even in the Jesus, different versions of the Jesus story that we have in our sacred canon. One genealogy traces Jesus back to David, the other genealogy traces him back to Adam, and you have this stuff going. By 70 CE, once Jerusalem is no more, and the temple is no more, and there's no more hope for well, the I should say that it's much more difficult to hope for a Davidic like Messiah, where he's going to come and reestablish the throne, and the temple would have had to have been rebuilt, Jerusalem would have had to have been rebuilt. Then what you have here is Jesus. Most scholars see what's happening here is the author of Matthew's gospel is having Jesus critique the son of David Messiah, and kind of show its limitations more in favor of Jesus being the more universal Messiah. And this would make sense because, again, they're living post destruction, and they're trying to make sense out of their place in the world. And what does Jesus look like now that we have no more temple, now that we have no more city, we have no more capital? What does it mean to be a Jewish Jesus follower now? And there was some resonance for that within the Jewish wisdom tradition of Daniel 7, where the Son of Man comes and liberates the people from all of these foreign oppressions, but it liberates all people from oppression, that all injustice, all oppression, all violence would be put to right. And so this is one of those passages where they're trying to get away from the nationalistic Messiah and get to a more universalist one. He's critiquing the Davidic school.
And not anti-Jewish. It is
no, not by any means
nationalist. It's because it includes the salvation, and the messiahship still applies to Jewish people. It just it become what you're suggesting here is that the tree expands beyond Judaism into other nationalities and other faith traditions.
Yeah, he's not just the Messiah bringing liberation from oppression for Jewish people. He's bringing an end to all oppression, injustice, and violence for all people, including Jewish people.
Right.
It's a more universalist lens. Yeah, so that's what I've got this week, Todd.
Well, we did it again. We put another episode in the can. So that's what we got for this week. And hope you guys enjoyed it. And Herb, we can find you where?
At renewedheartministries.com, and everywhere the clicks after that will lead you. Todd, where can we find you?
Don't worry about it. It's not there's nothing there. Don't worry about it right now. We'll I'll tell you when there's something worth checking out.
Start so posting on Renewed
Right now,
Heart
just
Ministries.
go to Herb stuff.
Yeah. I'm still
just check out Herb stuff.
Send me some articles. All right. Thanks everyone for watching. Tune in next week for another thought-provoking discussion. I hope thought-provoking discussion.
We hope. It's always an open question. So, all right, guys. We'll see y'all next week.
Thanks for watching.